Thank you for joining us on A Different Side of Learning. My name is Shakira Rouse, creator and founder of Special Compass, an organization dedicated to helping students with learning disabilities and other exceptional needs achieve success inside and outside the classroom. In this podcast, we an inclusive conversation. Everything's around surrounding those different kinds of learners in the classroom. We're going to talk about it, the way to support them, but most importantly, how to help them to be successful on their journey to success. A little bit of a tongue twister there. With me today in this conversation is Danny, who is always equally passionate about me on this cause and this discussion. So, Danny, thank you for joining us again on this different sides of learning. And this week, I wanted to have a conversation about learning disabilities, and particularly what inspired me at this conversation was something that you had mentioned last week when you were talking about your experience, with your LD and going through the education system. You had mentioned how it's like one of your teachers, they didn't believe it was possible for you to be gifted and have an LD. Like you had to be one or the other. Like you couldn't be in both categories. And it kind of made me think about, okay, really, what is people's perception and understanding of what an LD is, a learning disability? You and I know that it's a loaded question, um, in many different ways, and there's stigma associated with words, unfortunately, like special and disability. Um, but yeah, I want to let's have our conversation to start there, talking about this idea of we have to be one or the other. We cannot be
Okay.
gifted and learning disability, have a learning disability.
Well, to quickly end that story that I was talking about last week, I actually, when I was finishing my undergrad at that program, printed out a whole bunch of research about music dyslexia. It's not really an official thing yet, but they're starting to do that research. And I had
Mm.
walked into his office and put it all on his desk. And I was like, I need you to look at this. And he kind of skimmed through it and he looked at me and he's like, wait, you weren't lying? And I was like, no, I really wasn't. And he did ultimately apologize to me, even though, I mean, it's a little bit too little too late because I kind of missed out on getting that music education from that program like I wanted to. But I do hope that he kind of learned from that and will be better in the future. And I did say that to him, that I just hope that the next time there's another kid that comes in and is saying this stuff, that you are a little bit more accommodating and a little bit more understanding. But that just kind of goes to show you, like, clearly his perception of what was going on with me was clearly like, I don't know how you got through all of these different programs and got all these awards and stuff, but you can't do this one thing. And because you can't do this one thing, you're just incapable of doing music. When realistically, having a disability generally just like, yes, there's always going to be certain things that I can't do, but I really can sight sing, for example, if I'm just accommodated. If I can color the notes, or if someone colors the notes for me, then I can sight sing. So I think that's where the misconception of disability truly lies, is that it's, I don't want to use like flowery language, but like, oh, you're just kind of like differently abled, but it's just that you have to do things in a different way, which isn't the standard way.
Mm. No, let's use that colorful language because I think that's also, um, I mean, I know that colorful language has, or should I say colorful, but the flowery language has good intentions. But it's one of those things where it's like kind of like one side's good intention, one side is kind of doing a little bit of harm, right? So I kind of feel like, okay, well, we don't want to call it a learning disability. Let's call it like a different kind of learner or learn differently with something else, right? But it kind of feel at the same time too, is like, okay, so you're making it seem like this word disability is a bad thing. And here I am, somebody that I don't see as a bad thing. I'm happy to embrace it. So what are you trying, like, what is that message that we're trying to send to people that are, that have no problem embracing that word disability? You're making it seem like, again, like you said, like having everyone learns and everyone learns differently in general. That's just like on the normal playing field of this. Um, but to to try to shy away from these words like disability and special, I just think that we're not necessarily. Um, I think doing a little bit more harm than it is good, because it's kind of sending this idea that, oh, special is a bad word, disability is a bad word. We should try to find a different word that is uh, makes people feel good. But what the problem is our perception and understanding of these words that are making people feel bad. If there's nothing, these words alone are not bad. There's nothing wrong with them, but it's just people's perception and understanding. And most particularly, I think it's people, um, more of their people like ableism. I think people
Yep,
that
it's
are not
100% rooted in ableism.
people that are, if you don't fall under this category or you can't identify or you're not connected, then it's like you cannot, you cannot be able to see and understand how how someone's different and can think different than you and able to do the same things that you do, but may be able to do it differently, right? So I think that's one of the big things about it. And I think it's really good that you did the research, because I think that's the key thing in all of this about just ending the stigma is because, so, okay, when we talk about learning disabilities, when we talk about neurodiversity in general, it's, well, neurodiversity is understand that there's a various, there are various forms and functions, like the brain is built differently and has various, I'm losing my word here, but the brain functions differently and there's different variations and variants of the brain structure. That's what I'm trying to find when we could talk about neurodiversity. And so one of the things I don't think a lot of people know is like, yes, we have access to the internet. Yes, we're in 2022. But the research when it comes to neuroscience in general is still very young. Like we're still trying to understand basic things about the brain, how the brain works in terms of memory, right? Still understanding certain things about, people that have stroke, that experience strokes, people that have different kinds of, brain concussions, trauma to the brain. So there's still like a lot of research in general about neuroscience that's still very young. And neuroscience in general is, I think I would also say it's kind of becoming more of a growing and popular topic. Like even if you think about it, mental health has only become a more of a prominent conversation in our society over the last 20 years. I feel like I'm being even a little bit generous if I say 20 years. Like mental health wasn't.
No, uh, because I mean, it's not too long ago that women were being diagnosed with hysteria if they were having postpartum symptoms or if they had anxiety or anything like that. So it's really not that far off. And actually, when I was about 7 or 8 years old, when I first got diagnosed, was in a study for ADHD at Sick Kids Hospital here in Toronto because they realized that they had spent their entire time talking about ADHD and only researched boys and didn't
Yes,
know how ADHD affected women differently or girls differently. And that's why you have this whole wave of people on TikTok who have been like diagnosed with ADHD in their 20s and 30s because they were literally only doing this research in like 2004.
exactly. And so exactly my point. Like all this research, and now even I guess think of the pandemic, right? When they were doing the data and doing the research, people were saying no, you need to have like more race-based data. You need to have more gender-based data, age-appropriate data for this reasons because we assume that okay, because ADHD is going to look the same way across everybody regardless, if you're, and we only need to study like white boys. That's all we need to study when it comes to understanding how ADHD looks like. But one of the things is that ADHD and many of these um, neuro, I'm losing my thoughts here. But anyways, it's just in general, when we talk about neurodiversity, it means that it's going to look different for everybody. So how you did the research, I think, was a fundamental part in opening up that teacher's eyes. Because a lot of the times when people are coming to understand what a learning disability is or special education is, they haven't done the research. They don't even have the knowledge themselves. they're just basing it off the stigma and other people's perception, the stories they hear, and what they assume to, what they the stories they hear or the interactions that they had probably were not necessarily like positive, right? So that is a big problem. No, I was just saying that I think that is a problem. So I think doing the research first it's critical to the dismantling the stigma when it comes to like learning disabilities and special education, autism, ADHD, all those things. Like you just cannot assume, and I think that's the big problem here is people are just making assumptions and not doing the research.
Yeah, and I also think part of the problem too is how we've kind of gone about incorporating kids with learning disabilities into the classroom. So, effectively, how this happened was legislation got passed, people fought for legislation. All of a sudden, classrooms had to be inclusive, and then all of a sudden, they're shoving all of these kids with disabilities into classrooms where they've never been before. And it kind of created a perception. So you could hear a lot of older people being like, where did all these people with disabilities come from? Like when I was growing up, we never saw people with disabilities that often. And that's because a lot of countries had what they call ugly laws, which basically made it illegal for people with disabilities to be out in public. So, of course, you didn't see them because they weren't allowed to be there. Or you have kids in a classroom who it's never stopped to like have this conversation where it's like, well, why does Johnny get more time on the test than I do? That's not fair. I would love more time on my test. But it's no teacher or no support staff is ever saying like, well, because Johnny has to work a little bit harder to solve these problems. So what takes you 10 minutes might take Johnny 20 minutes. So realistically, it's not really giving Johnny extra time in the same way like he has an advantage against you. It's just giving him the level playing field so that you both can show what you both understand. Things like that. Like that's what's missing and that's what's not happening. And that's creating more and more of a stigma, as well as with how the media portrays disability. And not just, I'm not talking about like shows, just like The Good Doctor, who the main character is autistic, but you even have the mythos of people like Elon Musk, who actually has autism. He was diagnosed back in the day, so he calls it Asperger's, but now we just call it the autism spectrum.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's just been touted as this genius, and that's why he can run all these companies and do all these things and get us to Mars. So you either have to be beyond intelligent and like a superstar, or you're the dumb kid in class and you're the hindrance. And there's really no in between. They're not
Mm,
like a full 3D character. It's more of a caricature. And I think that's where a lot of the problems come.
I like that. It's more of a caricature. Yeah, I definitely agree. That's it. That's definitely. It's funny you say that because when I started talking, telling my story about how I create Special Compass and sharing it, I did get a couple of people go, "Really? You don't look like you have an LD, or but you're so
I get it all the
smart."
time.
I
Oh,
know, and I'm just like, yeah, like, okay. So, but to go back to your point there where you're talking about accommodations, yeah. How I also explain to people too is that you got to understand that some things that like now we're talking about it and it needs to be talked about more often. Not everything is visible. So if you have a student in the classroom that they know they wear the glasses, but they don't have their glasses, they forgot them in their backpack. Are you going to say you can't go get into your backpack to get your glasses so you can do the test when you know that they need the glasses to read, right, or to help them to see the test paper, the questions, right? So it's the same concept. I think people also assume that um, because that we have, we get accommodations to have, let's say, 15 minutes extra time for every 30 minutes or whatever it comes down to, that, oh my gosh, all of a sudden they are able to have these like write out all these magnificent answers. Do you know how many times I've had like the extra hours and I'm still sitting there puzzled of what I'm going to write for this answer, like the when I still had the same 1 hour time that everyone else did. And it's not necessarily that like, oh, because I have the extra 15 minutes now, I'm going to get like, I'm going to go from a B to an A plus. that extra time is to allow students that time to process and think. Even just in and when they have those have accommodations in a separate classroom to be able to write their tests in a separate classroom, because sometimes we just need a little bit more uh, peace and quiet to help us to concentrate and focus. I know for myself, I can't take a loud silence. That's one thing I always tell my mistake. I can't take a loud silence. So I have to have some kind of soft music going on in the background to help me concentrate and focus. Um, so being able to know that, I'm able to advocate for myself and tell people what I need to be successful. Doesn't mean that just because she has music on, she's like, or headphones on, that she's like listening to the answers or something. There's still this, we still have to go through the same protocol to make sure that everyone is getting the same treat, is not, has no access to cheat sheets or anything. Like, so yeah, it just baffles my mind how people think things.
And I also think that we could lose a lot of the stigma of accommodations if accommodations were made um, more accessible to everyone, in the sense
Mm-hmm.
that, like, a lot of the things that are accommodations for people with disabilities are only having to be accommodations because we have the legal protection to force places and institutions and whatever to do them, when it would actually benefit everyone to do them. Like, things like tests. Why do tests need to be timed? If the point of the test is to show your knowledge, what is the purpose of trying to force out that knowledge in a certain amount of time?
Yeah, I
Like,
agree.
just as a simple example, so there are kids who don't have a learning disability but might have test anxiety and could benefit from being able to take an extra 15-20 minutes just to relax and calm down, or not feel as pressured in terms of a time crunch, and then could better express what they actually know and understand. So it's all those little things, or like extra time on assignments and things like that, where life happens to absolutely everyone. Things happen, and sometimes we need an extra few days. But instead of that being this punishable thing, oh, it's 10% off every day you're late or whatever, if we just made our society overall more accessible, not only would that reduce stigma, but I think we'd live in a much healthier and better environment.
No, yeah, I agree. And that's the thing, that's why I love inclusive education, because so yes, when I was doing my studies in inclusive education, yes, we did talk about students with learning disability, ADHD, and various exceptionalities. But I think people need to move away from this idea that, um, again, it has to be separate. A lot of the things that you said, like a lot of the things that people, the accommodations, the assistive technology, just the method of instruction that are to help students with exceptional needs, can be easily incorporated into a general classroom. And most of the time, a lot of these support systems, I shouldn't say in support system, I'd say method of instructions, okay, um, are benefit to all students. So it's more of, again, I think it's like coming back with that perspective of how do you view education, right? Are we here to just do regurgitate information and perform well on a test? Or are we supposed to build knowledge? And if we're supposed to build knowledge, that's my understanding of education and my pedagogy. How are we going to help those students get to that level of building knowledge? And then looking at what needs to be created in that space, in that environment, that's going to help facilitate that uh, escalation of higher knowledge. So it's, yeah, I totally agree. And even when you said about the accommodations and life happens, many people don't realize this, especially in the post-secondary level, that yeah, life happens. I had this happen to me when, when you're going to an exam, coming in exam season, and my grandfather passed away, and I had to tell my professors, I said, look, I had a sudden death in the family, and I need to go to like Montreal and all this kind of stuff. Is it okay if I hand in my, assignments a couple of days late? And all of them were accommodating. Actually, they said, just let me know when you're able to submit it. Um, And it's things like that. Just being able to go to your professor and say, hey, this is what's going on, such and such, many students don't realize that. And then I think on the flip side of this is that there's students that, that have exceptionalities that feel that they don't want to be different or they don't want to be othered. And so now they're struggling and trying to feel like that they need to perform at the same level or look like the same way as like their non-exceptional peers. But maybe in silence, both students are silent, are not silent, are suffering, and they actually do need support, right? So it's all about definitely ending the stigma, and I think most importantly, having these open conversations. And I think more particularly, you and I having these conversations to Black women, to women of color, to young women, because I do notice too that now that I've stepped into this space of education, special education, inclusive education, it's still predominantly a lot of white. It's still a predominantly white space.
Mm-hmm.
And even that is it's a little bit problematic in many ways too. And I do have it where some parents are like, I don't know if this teacher is targeting my child or if there's actually something going on.
Oh yeah. And I think in the Black community there's so much stigma, like they don't want their kid to be labeled that they end up kind of, I don't want to say attacking first, but like coming with hostility, I guess is the better way to phrase it.
Yeah.
Even when a teacher has a good intention, like I can give you an example. When I was doing this music program, there was a little girl who was always falling asleep in my class every single day. I wasn't ever mad at her for falling asleep, but one time when her mom came to pick her up, I was trying to address that concern with her mom. And the reason why I was bringing it up was because that could have been some sort of health issue that her mom is not aware of. That's the space that I was coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to let her know that that's what's going on, and I wasn't sure why, and bring to her attention just in case that needs to be something she brings to her doctors or something. Well, it turns out the reason why the little girl, because it was an after school program, so the reason why this little girl was falling asleep in my class was because her mom had to get her up at like 5 o'clock in the morning to bring her to her grandmother's house because the mom had to work, and it was a whole situation.
Oh.
Um, but when I started having this conversation with the mom, she came at me like I was judging her for having to work hard and having to get her kid up early and all this kind of stuff. And where I was coming from was, well, if your child is just randomly falling asleep for no reason, that's a health concern that's concerning. But based on her life experiences, based on other teachers having issues and all those kinds of things, that's where she thought I was coming from. And by the
Gotcha.
end of the conversation, she totally understood where I was coming from, told me what was happening, and said, okay, if she ever needs to sleep, she can sleep. That's not a problem. As long as she's healthy and okay, we're good. But it's those kind of things. It's those, clearly she's had a whole bunch of other experiences, negative experiences with teachers, that she came at the entire situation with her walls up. Instead of
Mm-hmm.
being a team, instead of being a support, instead of being able to sit down and figure out how we can help her child to continue to learn. And that's what ends up happening a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like it's amazing how many people were able to pursue education during the pandemic because we were forced to be accessible.
Yes.
And all of this, oh, let's get back to normal, I think is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, because whether you have a disability or not, just having your lectures recorded because they're on Zoom. So if you, yes,
Life
as a
changer.
chronically ill person or a person with a disability, yes, that's helpful to me because if I'm sick or I can't get out of bed today, I still have access to class. But that also helps the mom who wants to go back to school, but the daycare called and her child has a fever and she has to be home, so she can still see class. Or it helps me as the person with the disability because I need to go back and rewatch it because I missed certain things to take my notes. Whereas before, I would have to use like a live scribe pen, and I'm sitting there with my digital recorder, having to get special permission to record lectures, which is the most ridiculous thing ever, and have special accommodations for slides from the teacher to be sent to me. That is literally helpful to everyone.
It's so funny you say this. Okay, so when I think about when I was in university and I had to like give those, so I had to give like a letter to my professors like that stated like my I need accommodations and what was going on. And I always remember there's like one French professor. It was a French linguistics course, and she was just such a tyrant. Like just like her the way she was, what she said, like she basically said like this is a very hard class. Like you need to make sure that you work hard and do keep up with it. Whoa, so you're assuming because I'm handing you this letter now that I cannot keep up with the workload or perform in this class? That already there is very discouraging. And so I think what again we're talking about how everyone should change their perspective and understand more when it comes to like teachers, and they also need to be able to understand the different diverse backgrounds your students are coming from. Point blank. I think people now are kind of getting a little bit more present to this, and now they're understanding the importance of it. But yeah, like I said this to I've been saying this a lot recently. Like, yes, we're living in one world, but there's multiple realities. So like your
Mhm.
reality is not my reality, and then everyone's even within people in the same reality, they're having different experiences, right? And I think that's what people need to recognize and realize. I have heard it sometimes where people are assuming like, how come? And I think we kind of always do this unconsciously. Like, how does this kid like not have a winter jacket or doesn't have proper like footwear or something? Like you don't know what's going on. Like we cannot just make assumptions and assume certain things. Rather, it should be that conversation where like how you that parent you said, okay, as long as she's good, she needs to sleep, go ahead, sleep. Sometimes it's just like the classroom has to be it needs to be a safe space where people could just be who they are. And I
Yep.
think that's the importance and the backbone of building an inclusive learning space.
Yep. And in terms of teachers, I think a lot of where that resentment or that stigma comes from is again, legislation was passed and all these kids with disabilities were suddenly put into these classrooms with A, no training for those teachers, and B, no supports. So this is why EAs are so important, because if you take a child, for example, who may have autism and needs help going to the bathroom, when that teacher has 30 kids in their classroom and they're by themselves and one child needs their entire attention just to go to the bathroom, let's say every hour, every couple hours, you are setting up an environment to create resentment towards that child.
Yep. Yep. I think I've said it last week and I'll say it again. Like every classroom should have a teacher, an EA, and a spec ed teacher, special education resource teacher, whatever you want to call it. Boom.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's those are the three people that should be the backbone of every classroom.
Yep. Or reduce class sizes. This is again where things don't make any sense. You're going to have all needs in one classroom. You're going to keep increasing class sizes, and then you only still have one teacher.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it doesn't work. And because of how our society is set up, we tend to basically put people with disabilities at the bottom of the totem pole. Um, and they're the ones who get pushed aside, and they're the ones who don't get the help that they need, which then leads to this perpetual cycle of, well, they're stupid, they don't know anything, they're behind, they're this, they're that. Well, maybe because they didn't get the supports that they needed to be up where their peers were.
Yeah. And so a couple of things you said there. So I feel like now we're talking about education and politics, and that could be a whole different topic, probably like
Yes,
a
it can.
part series, knowing you and I. And then I just lost it. But anyways, that's a whole different context in general. But just to kind of like wrap up, what are your final thoughts on this whole perception of learning disability and just exceptionality in general? To yeah.
I truly think that we just need a space for people with disabilities to have a voice. People with
Mm,
disabilities should be creating their own content, their own stories, so that you have a more diverse picture or a more complete picture of what it actually means to be living with a disability instead of just the caricatures that we generally get in media. And I think that will help a lot of that stigma. Um, and I think that it will. push our society forward. So I know because of the events that happened in 2020, we're getting a lot more DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion committees. I think those are super important because they bring voices to the table that weren't heard before, and those voices then can help to create change within small pockets of community, which will impact the larger community.
Good. I like that. Yeah. So 2020, so for me, my final thoughts are 2020 was an eye-opener year. I think we, as a society, collectively, we saw where in our systems do we have holes, and we realized there's a lot. And I think at the same time, too, it was an uprising of those people whose voices have been historically marginalized. They're like, enough, we're not taking this anymore, and we're coming back. So this is why exactly how you said we have DEI community committees, sorry, in many different spaces. Diversity, equity, inclusion is, consistently being circled around as being buzzwords. So if this is where spaces we're moving, I encourage other people to change your perspective and just be open. Drop your perception of what you assume, a learning disability is, what diversity, equity, inclusion is, and just be like open to learning, receptive, have conversation with somebody that, that looks more different than you, just because you never know like how much you're going to learn from them, right? So I think that's my final thought, to just let's just change our perception and really open up our minds and our eyes and to learn something new.
I agree.
With that final thought, Danny, I want to thank you for joining me in this conversation of a different side of learning. And stay tuned for next week. We're going to talk about more topics relating to inclusive education and special education, and just everything that surrounds the different kinds of learners in the classroom. Once again, my name is Shakira Rouse, and I'll speak to you next week.